The Growing Democracy Project is organized by Dr. Boyd Swan, myself, and Anna, who's in the back. And the goal of the project is to do a series of workshops on campus and workshops up in Cleveland around community organizing and thinking about all the different ways that we can be involved in growing democracy outside of voting, right? So voting is absolutely important, but we want to think about all the other ways that we can be engaged in the civic and political life of our communities. So we have a series of programs that will run from today through October. Everything from the role of the media in community, finding your voice. So we'll do some workshops on storytelling and thinking about how we can leverage our voice and our narratives in our communities. We have projects coming up on navigating bureaucracy, right? So thinking about how we are active and engaged people within our community also requires us to think about how we can navigate bureaucracy and the power of being able to do that. But our next session is actually in April, and we have two events planned. So they're both on Thursday, April 18th. So we encourage you to come. The first is our event on campus. We're going to show a screening of a new documentary film that just came out in 2018. It's called Councilwoman. It's about a woman who is a cleaner in a hotel in Rhode Island who ran for city council and won. It's really about her story of being a union member, a community organizer, and coming into elected office and thinking about what that's meant for her as a woman who is Dominican, she speaks English, but doesn't speak all the language and doesn't have the political power that many people that run for elected office have. And then we'll also have a session in Cleveland again called Backyard Civics 101, hosted by Shannon Garrett. She is the co-founder of Vote Run Lead, so if you've heard of it. Also co-founder of a program called Civicize Me, and the president of SMG Strategies. And she does political training, campaign strategist, and is a candidate coach. So a lot of great things coming up. I also want to bring to your attention some materials that are available to you. This program is sponsored by a bunch of people on campus, but also it's a grant-sponsored program through the American Political Science Association. We had some seed money to be able to launch the program, and so we really want to just thank APSA. It's also sponsored by the Scholar Strategy Network, which is a network of political scientists, policy advocates, and researchers doing work to connect our research to communities, right? It's also sponsored by the Women's Center, as well as RASP here at Kent State. All right, so those are all my announcements. One more. You also have program evaluations on your chairs, and we really encourage you to fill those out and leave them with us before you leave.
If there's not one on your seat,
we have more. All right. Without further ado, I want to welcome our guests. We have with us today Jacqueline Blake and Brandy Blessett. Jacqueline Blake is the program manager for Student Mediation Services on campus here at Kent. SMS offers services such as mediation, facilitation, conflict coaching to students and student organizations. Jacqueline also teaches courses with the School of Peace and Conflict Studies. She was born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, so she's local, before earning a BA in Applied Conflict Management and Political Science with an emphasis in international relations from Kent State. Jacqueline worked as a social worker before relocating to the East Coast for graduate school. Jacqueline earned a Master's of Science in Conflict Analysis and Resolution from George Mason University and focused much of her research on gender and disability conflicts in the workplace. Jacqueline worked for Americans with Disabilities Act mediation program at Keybridge Center for Mediation in Washington, D.C., before coming back to Kent to develop the Student Mediation Services program. Our other guest that's joining us is Dr. Brandy Blessett. She's an associate professor and director of the Masters of Public Administration program at the University of Cincinnati. Dr. Blessett's research focuses on administrative responsibility, disenfranchisement, and social equity. Her research interests offer insight regarding the effects of institutional and systemic injustice and their contemporary implications for underrepresented communities. Much of her work acknowledges the disproportionate effects of criminal legal system, specifically, but public institutions broadly, that have on people of color. Dr. Blessett's research agenda advocates for ethical practices, professional standards, and accountability measures to promote equity, justice, and fairness to all sections of U.S. society. She's a Center for Accountability and Performance Fellow, serves on the editorial board for Public Integrity, and is the program evaluator for Renew Camden, a federal reentry program that seeks to help formerly incarcerated persons successfully reintegrate back into society. So for today, I have a series of questions for them to answer that really are grounded in their own areas of expertise. We're interested in really digging into the idea of how we facilitate difficult dialogues, which is at the core of being able to grow a robust democratic society, right? So we have to be able to think about how we navigate these conversations. So I'm going to start actually with Jacqueline. And my first question is, what is the starting point for difficult dialogues? And how do you establish or create or organize spaces for those conversations?
So, first and foremost, I think creating a space in and of itself is an important thing to do. I think a lot of time when we have difficult conversations, we do so because we feel the necessity, because we're feeling strongly about something and we need to acknowledge it right that moment. And sometimes that makes sense to have a difficult conversation right in the moment when something happens. And sometimes it also makes sense to take a step back and find a space where that conversation can happen. It also makes sense to ask the other person if they have time to engage in that conversation, because they may not have the time to do so in that moment. And to make sure that we are in a space where we ourselves can have that conversation. So, if we just pulled an all-nighter at the library and we come home to a conflict with our roommate or partner, that may not be the best time for us to engage in that conversation. So it's also knowing that these conversations aren't always fun or enjoyable. Sometimes they're really uncomfortable, and we have to kind of prepare ourselves accordingly for that. And that requires self-care, and it requires listening to ourselves when we engage in conversations with others. So it's not an easy thing to do, to talk about something that brings up strong feelings for us. But if we can find that space, if we can make sure it's a good time to talk, if we can maybe have a snack before we have the conversation, we'll find that probably it'll go a little better, and also that it may not be as hard as we anticipated it being. Because these hard conversations bring up feelings in our body, feelings that have potentially been stored in our body for long before this conflict arose. So just kind of being aware of that and being willing to get a little bit uncomfortable, I think, is kind of the best we can do sometimes.
Rita, do you have anything you want to add in terms of that question?
Well, you took all my shine. So I would agree with everything that you said. I think that in these spaces, right, we're on an academic, we're on a campus, and I think that in our classrooms are great spaces to have these conversations, right? I think that we often socialize with people who are of the like mind, right? And so we are reinforcing ideas that we value or things that won't challenge us. And so I think within a college classroom, to be able to have these spaces and have a conversation, I think is an important opportunity. But not every classroom is capable, and not every instructor is capable of doing that. And so I think that, in my classes, what I try to do is, from the very beginning of each semester, is create some ground rules so that we're all comfortable with one another, realizing that over time, so I don't know about you, but in my classes, no one wants to talk in like the first 2 weeks, and by like 5 or 6, everybody's best friends, and then by week 12, nobody wants to stop talking, right? And so it's growing a relationship over time that helps people have these difficult conversations and be able to trust one another, whereby let's talk about issues, let's not make it personal, right? And so the ability to, one, create a space where we can interrogate things that are maybe not only difficult but controversial, to be able to feel comfortable that you're not going to be attacked personally, but we're attacking ideas, not people, but also using a language or creating a space where we're able to listen to the other side, right? Oftentimes we listen we oftentimes we are immediate in our reaction and wanting to respond without actually having heard what the other person is saying. And so I think that our ability to like just sit back and really try to digest what the issues are, where a person's coming from, trying to humanize these issues in a way that can allow you to sit in their experience to the best of your ability. I think it creates a space where we can begin to have dialogues, we can begin to challenge ideas, we can begin to, although be uncomfortable, move to a space where we're opening ourselves up to a different reality or a different perspective.
So this question is directed first to Brandy. How does social justice intersect with difficult dialogues, and why is it important for us important for achieving social justice to engage in difficult dialogues?
That's a great question. So oftentimes I think that so I'm starting a social justice program in Cincinnati. It's a Master's of Public Administration program, and while social justice and social equity issues are now becoming buzzwords, right? And so you hear it all the time, you see it on websites, everyone's like, yeah, social justice is great, right? But in order to do that, you have to be willing to have hard conversations, going back to the first question. And those hard conversations, if we're talking about justice and inequity or injustice and inequity, we have to understand how those realities came to be, right? And to be able to talk about institutional racism or systemic oppression or discrimination, or to say those words are so loaded that people automatically shut off, right? And they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to confront these issues. But if we don't confront it, then we never move past it, right? Bell Hooks always talks about, and Bell Hooks, Black feminist scholar, talks about the fact that if you can't name the issue, you can't confront it, how do you solve it, right? And so it becomes important that we aren't turned off by the language, but that we're open to interrogating these ideas. If we can begin to understand institutional racism and what racism is and how discrimination manifests itself in us as people, throughout our institutions, through our policies, through our types of engagement, I think we become more able to work toward justice. But we can't continue to have veiled conversations about these ideas and not want to talk about issues of race in a society where race means everything, right? So all of these things have to be at the forefront of our willingness to engage in these conversations, and they have to be a part of our teaching and our practice, not only, again, as people, but as we move into our professions.
Anything you want to add?
I would just echo that sentiment. The only way forward is through. And so I think a lot of times, we have these very strong feelings about issues in our society, issues that have been around ever since we've become a society. And so that brings up strong feelings, and that in turn creates defensiveness within us, and then as a result, our ears turn off. So as humans, we have to be able to work through that, or we're just going to continue doing the same thing over and over again.
And I think I just want to, so and one of the things when I do some of these workshops, and some of them are called doing the work, right? It requires us to, one, understand our own personal bias, right? So if anybody in this room would say that I don't have bias, then you're lying to yourself and you're lying to everybody in here, right? And so the reality is everyone has bias, but what does that look like, and how does that bias impact how you do your job, how you engage with people, so on and so forth. And so I think that's the first part of this work, is to admit that we have bias, think about how that bias impacts how we engage and do the work that we do. But we also have to be willing to not only acknowledge it, but do something about it, right? Oftentimes, we know that there's a problem out there, but we don't want to do anything because it requires that we do something personally, right? We have to do work. And so if we don't, we can talk about problems. I'm in a space where, there's lots of reports. There's a report about race, there's a report about class, there's a report about gender inequity. But the reports don't mean anything if we're not willing to put institutions or policies or infrastructure or resources in place to make change. And so I guess I want to get, acknowledging it is one thing, but doing something about it is something totally different.
So Jacqueline, maybe that builds really well. So what are some of the things that we need to do as individuals to prepare to engage in these difficult dialogues?
Well, I mean, I think Brendan nailed it in that we have to be willing to acknowledge what's coming up for us. And so the work that I've done helps me to realize that, and you know, this isn't groundbreaking or revolutionary, but we do what we know as humans. And so if you grew up in a home where your voice was only heard if you shouted loud enough, you know, that's what you're going to be doing. If you grew up in a home where there was a lot of silence, that's going to be how you operate. And so being aware of how we grew up and how we learned how to communicate is the first step in doing it differently. Because our family dynamics, not only do they teach us what to do, they in fact change our brain chemistry. They change how our brains are developed. And so thinking that we are these unbiased creatures that are walking around giving everyone the benefit of the doubt and not judging folks is wildly inaccurate. And the only thing we can do is really develop awareness of that. And the first thing is noticing, and also noticing non-judgmentally, because again, we do what we know until we know better. So judging ourselves for how we're operating doesn't really help us to change up what we're doing. So noticing is due, and then there's a lot of ways that we can build on top of that. I highly recommend therapy. I realize that's not for everyone, but I think a lot of folks would benefit from that because, again, how our family dynamics were present in the home we grew up in our family of origin, that shapes the people we become, and that also shapes whether we're able to engage. Because it's easier to just not feel. It's easier to see the bad thing and be like, and then distract and numb ourselves with something else. So being able to feel that and take action and being willing to make mistakes and not judge ourselves for that in the hopes that we can learn and do better, that's really the only thing we can do. And it's definitely the first step.
So, Brittany, do you want to add in? So my question to you then, Brittany, is thinking more institutionally. What are some of the steps that public agencies might be able to put into place, or the role of public agencies in helping to facilitate these difficult dialogues?
So public agency, I mean, I think any agency is difficult just because, I mean, you think about bureaucracy, it's large, it's big, it's messy, it's slow, right? Like, and so I think a willingness, from an institutional perspective, I would say it starts from the top of leadership, right? Because organizational culture is important. And so a leader that values equity or values change is going to create not only a mandate, but put resources behind it and or create a culture that says that this is okay and this is the direction that we're moving in first. Second, institutions could do equity audits, right? They could do pay analysis, right? So one of the things that's happening in Cincinnati city government right now is they're doing a number of gender equity audits to see across agencies, boards and commissions, and all of these kind of inter-agency collaborations and or institutions, to what extent are women specifically, what are they being paid compared to their white male counterparts, right? So I think that's a wonderful step for city government to be taking the lead on an issue like pay equity, right? We know that for every dollar that a man makes, a white woman makes 77 cents, a black woman makes 68 cents, a Latino woman makes 53 cents, right? So those dynamics really impact a long-term quality of life. I think that if you're going to do this work, you have to be very authentic and intentional, right? So it doesn't do us any good to have a policy and say, yes, we're going to do this and we're going to champion this, and it's a watered down version of it, because in order to get people to believe what you're doing, you have to be committed to it for the long term. And I think that in a lot of ways, we aren't willing to commit to the long term. We want short fixes. We want something that's going to happen within an election cycle. If it doesn't happen in 2 years, we don't want to do it, or it's been deemed a failure, right? And so, we didn't get into this mess overnight. We're not going to get out of it overnight, but we have to be willing to put in the resources, the energy, and the patience in order to see this thing, whatever it is, to the end. And so, the ability to not only do equity audits, but again, if you're an organization and you perform an equity audit, not only for pay, but for any number of different issues, and you get a report that says, we're terrible, we haven't been doing things right, if you don't act on that report, then it's just a disingenuous effort, right? And so I think we have to be willing to face the realities of what would come out of these things as well. And so I think it just requires really a strategic commitment by leadership, but also the people who buy into this idea that equity matters and that public institutions need to be responsive to the broader public, not just the ones with the loudest mic, not just the ones with the most resources, not just the ones that have all the political prowess, right? All communities in a democratic society need to be represented and resources allocated to them in a way that is equitable and fair and just.
I'm thinking of more questions that I didn't give them as they're talking. But I'll stick with my script for now and then other ones that are coming up. So this goes to Jacqueline. Are there certain actions or behaviors or language that are particularly constructive to engaging in difficult dialogues? And so you started by talking about thinking about yourself and thinking about the space that you're in and being prepared, but also in terms of when engaging, are there types of behaviors or actions that are going to be helpful to encouraging people to hear you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can't stress enough using reflective listening skills if we have to have a difficult conversation. I think that that's really necessary. And Brandy touched on this earlier, how, we may not have even heard what that person has said before we're reacting to what they've said. So being able to actually hear someone, and sometimes how I frame that is trying to just be genuinely curious about what the person is trying to express, which can be really hard to do when someone's saying something that you know in your heart of hearts is wrong. But when you can be genuinely curious about where they're coming from, you may find there's information that you weren't aware of that doesn't change your mind, but helps you to see where that person's coming from. I think the space makes a huge difference as well. I recently went to a conflict resolution conference where I heard a mediator talk about how she no longer holds mediations in her office. She actually rents space that's like on a mountainside. And she takes folks up there to do mediations, and she hasn't had an unsuccessful case since she started doing it that way, because she said she's noticing, when you're staring at a gorgeous mountainside retreat, those little things just aren't as important because you're seeing this beautiful space that helps you to see the big picture. I would also say, if you have one individual that you're having a challenge with, I think our natural reaction is to kind of, as a group, gang up on that person, and it feels really good, but it doesn't necessarily have the impact we're looking for. So if you have one person who you need to engage on something with, I recommend having a one-on-one conversation with that person first, at least, because that's helpful. It makes folks feel less defensive. And again, if you don't have access to like a mountainside retreat, you can take a walk. So sometimes having a difficult conversation, especially with someone who may not be your biggest fan, walking side by side with them in nature is a significantly different space than sitting face to face with them in a windowless room. So how we approach that person, the space that we approach that person, our willingness to hear them, that makes a difference, I've noticed.
I guess the only thing I would add is that language matters, right? And so the words you say or don't say really have an implication for how people hear you or don't hear you. And I would just be mindful of the language that we use if we're talking about difficult dialogues, right? So I'll just say that the language is important and language matters.
So one of the questions that I have is, engaging in difficult dialogues takes on different forms in different environments. Mm-hmm. So how would, and this question goes to Brandy first, how do different power relations impact the ability to engage in difficult dialogues?
So I immediately think about, so I don't have kids, but I've seen like the parent-child dynamic, right? Like I grew up in a household, my parents were great, but once they say it because I said so, then that was pretty much it. But I have friends who have taken a very different relationship with their children. And so it's not about because I said so, but it's more of a conversation that they have with their small children. And I think that in a lot of ways, when those kids grow up, they'll be able to, thinking about Jacqueline's comments about how our families train our brains and like all of those things that happen, I think those are very different relationships that those kids will have in terms of their ability to engage in conversation and talk about their emotions and those types of things. I think the power dynamic is really interesting and unique because, I think about in the workplace, right? If you are in an environment where it's top-down heavy and, again, you have a very authoritative boss, can you say something without fear of retribution? Can you say something without fear of retaliation? And that becomes very difficult. And so, going back to this idea of leadership and organizational culture, they're the people that are going to steer the ship to either say, we have an organization that is going to be open for communication, open for disagreement, open for dialogue, or if you don't agree, then just be quiet and make your life easy, right? And so I think those things matter. And I hope that all of you will go out and be leaders one day and be mindful of these types of things because, the relationship that you have at work, it doesn't just stay at work, right? Like it spills over into your life. It spills over into other aspects of other relationships. And, to be working with someone who is a tyrant, it takes its toll. It really does. And it impacts your productivity. And so I guess more than anything, that those power dynamics, if they can't be checked, need to be mediated in some way so that the person who doesn't have the power can still have their voices heard, can still feel protected and safe, and not feel like there's going to be some retaliation in response to them expressing themselves about things that they care about, value, or just want to offer an opinion on.
Do you want to add?
Spot on. I don't think anything to add.
Jacqueline, this goes back to you, and I think is specifically relevant to the previous question that I asked about what are actions for making a constructive conversation. Are there specific actions that can make it very destructive? Like if you go into it in a certain way that it's probably not going to go the way that you want it to go.
Yeah, well, I think having expectations in general for how it's going to go can really impact things. So that's expectations it's not going to go well. That's expectations that it's going to go fine. And it's hard not to have expectations. I realize it's easier said than done, but if we can drop our expectations, that tends to make a difference. And I would also say if we can practice non-judgment as well, which again is incredibly difficult to do when we're talking with someone who we inherently disagree with, because and related to how our brain is trained, it's no longer that this person is expressing an opinion that we disagree with, it's that this person is a bad person and they're trying to make me feel bad, or why on earth would they think that way? How on earth could they come to that conclusion? And when we frame it in that way, it limits the options in front of us. And so it's hard not to judge folks. It's an automatic reaction for us as humans, but if we can practice non-judgment and not have expectations for how the conversation should look or what it's going to achieve, that tends to really take it down a notch and allows the space to be more open for a more constructive conversation.
Sobriety helps.
Yeah.
You're not going to have a constructive conversation if anybody is on anything other than water. So just keep that in mind.
So Brady, this is more in line. This question's more in line with your academic research and the work that you're doing. So how does your professional research and your academic scholarship shape, or how are you hoping to shape these ideas of inclusivity and being able to have difficult dialogue? So can you tell us a little bit about the work you're doing, I suppose is the question.
Sure. So the current project that I'm working on is examining the experiences that LGBTQ people of color have with the New Orleans Police Department. And as I think about inclusivity, the narratives and experiences that these folks have shared is often muted and or ignored. And so oftentimes when we have conversations with law enforcement, around law enforcement issues, law enforcement perspective really dictate the conversation. So you only hear their side of the story, you don't hear the other side in any capacity. And so as I think about, and so, my work in terms of administrative discretion is, and I asked this yesterday in the presentation that I gave, but how many of you have ever gotten out of a ticket? Right? Lots of us have. And part of that is because the police officer who pulled you over decided that whatever you did didn't warrant me to give you a ticket as much as a citation. And that was a decision point that that officer had to either ticket or cite. And oftentimes in these interactions, particularly in vulnerable communities, particularly in communities of color, the discretion has always lent itself to a more harsher treatment, a harsher outcome. And as a result, it's created this narrative and or tension in communities of color with law enforcement and vice versa. And so I don't want you to take this conversation and say that I think that all Black people hate cops, because that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that all law enforcement hate Black people. But what I'm saying is there's a long history and there's a long tension, and we're not willing to have those conversations about why that exists, how those relationships have evolved over time. And until we're able to do that, then that tension will continue to manifest itself in various ways, including distrust, a lack of communication, and really a delegitimization of our public institutions, right? Law enforcement officials are supposed to serve and protect. And I would argue that there are lots of people that I talk to and people that I know that don't think law enforcement serves and protects them, right? And so I think that this conversation is important, but I also think that the ability to hear the other side of the story humanizes people and humanizes place in a way that we don't often get in mass media and in public opinion, political discourse. And so I think that holistically, from this project, wanting to highlight these voices and experiences in a way that give them, I don't want to say legitimacy, but that give them a place at the table where they can be equally considered in the same tone and in the same vein as law enforcement. And I think that in training folks for difficult dialogues, again, being able to confront the bias that each of these groups have about the other, and being able to sit in an uncomfortable space and learn from one another. But that isn't going to happen overnight, and it's going to require, again, a time commitment and an effort in order to build those relationships, because they have been so contentious and so hostile for so long.
Jacqueline, this question goes to you, and it's similar in the sense of professionally, a lot of the work that you do is professional mediation. Could you tell us a little bit about your work and what that looks like, but also what you hope people walk away with, from mediation with?
Mm-hmm. So a lot of the work I do is intervening in conflicts that have occurred on campus. So the most common conflicts that come with the mediation office are going to be roommate conflicts in the residence halls. So at times, when folks who live in the residence halls are experiencing conflict and want a room change as a result, they're required to come see me. And there's many other things that we do, sometimes relationship conflicts, sometimes student-org conflicts, but a lot of times it's roommate conflict. So what I hope that folks will get out of it is some sort of clarity. The most common story I hear from folks is that they haven't really talked at length with the person they're experiencing conflict with. There's been a lot of silence and they haven't really expressed their needs or felt like they haven't been able to express their needs. Because again, having these conversations isn't fun, and it certainly doesn't feel fun in our body when someone in front of us is bringing up strong feelings. So I hope that folks will get just some sort of clarity out of the communication that has not occurred before that time. Mm-hmm. And what I share with folks is, the thing about mediation, and a lot of folks don't realize this because they think it's either a punitive thing or they think it's counseling. Outcomes that come through conflict resolution are going to be up to you. Mm-hmm. And we value our own outcomes significantly more than when an authority figure tells us what to do. So I think a lot of times we don't want to have a difficult conversation because it makes us feel bad. We don't like the way conflict feels. And also sometimes we want someone to just kind of hold our hand and make a decision for us because it's hard. It's hard figuring out, what am I going to do? This isn't working for me and I don't want it to look like this anymore. So for someone to then be given hours in a space in which they're able to express themselves fully and make decisions for themselves, mm-hmm. that's a different dynamic than what we're used to. Mm-hmm. So again, if there's any sort of clarity or understanding, or even just this didn't go as awfully as I thought it would, and I got some things that I needed. So yeah, I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to go for.
Yeah. So I have one more question before I open it up to the group, and this comes from a variety of things that both of you have said but haven't explicitly mentioned before. What's the role of safety in terms of personal safety, safety of space, in terms of engaging in the difficult dialogue, and kind of personal self-care, all of those things that go into it. How should we think about it as students, as faculty, as staff, as people on a university campus? That was a really long question because it wasn't written. So.
I think that's a great question, which is why I think that, you know, the place that you decide to have these conversations matter. So, you know, talking politics at a bar is not going to be, you know, like, you know, we've all kind of seen TV shows where folks are just, you know, one drink away from just like going crazy. And so, but I think that like being aware of your surroundings is important. And so while I talk about creating brave spaces in the classroom, that isn't, so you're not gonna, it probably isn't a good idea for your first class and your first part of your semester to like go in hard and just start talking about all the things that you wanna just, you know, have the most difficult conversation on day one, right? I think about developing that relationship over time so that students are comfortable with each other. You're comfortable with them, they're comfortable with you. You created and cultivated a space where people feel comfortable enough to have these conversations, one. The second thing is just be smart, right? Like I'm a big fan of body language. Like I really feel like I can pay attention to when people are agitated. And if you can see kind of someone being agitated, maybe this isn't the best time to engage in those conversations. And safety is really an important time, particularly on a college campus, because there so many incidents happen, right? And I think about the fact that, so I just moved to Cincinnati in August, and in September I'm walking around campus, and there's a dude walking around campus with an assault rifle, right? Like he can't technically go into any buildings, but he can walk on campus because it's a public space. And I think our ability, right, like, so on the one hand, I think it's completely absurd that we have to do these kind of trainings to protect ourselves on campuses. But that's the reality of the situation. And I want us to be aware that because that reality exists, that every conversation may not need to be had. It may not be worth it to have every conversation. And for my self-care, if I know that you aren't in a place to hear me, I'm not going to engage in a conversation with you, period. I don't care what I think the outcome is going to be. There are certain people that I just refuse to talk to because I know that they are not going to hear me, and I like the breath that I have. I want to, you know, preserve it for the last of my days, right? And I don't want to waste it on someone who is not trying to engage with me in a proactive and productive way. And so I think we have to choose our battles, and some battles shouldn't, they're not worth fighting. And so I think in terms of the self-care, being mindful of what that looks like, and if it's even worth it, because sometimes it's not worth it.
I think there's a legitimate need for safe spaces in our communities, especially on college campuses, and I think the narrative around safe spaces has gotten really not good, because I think a lot of times we joke around about these sorts of things, and I think the folks that would poke fun at the concept of a safe space haven't really needed a safe space in their entire life. So that's something to consider. And I would also say, you know, and this is piggybacking off of the points I've been trying to make today, that at times these difficult conversations actually make us feel unsafe in our bodies. And so it's important to note that just because you're uncomfortable doesn't mean you're physically in danger. And now, of course, like if you're in danger, you know, you gotta go. Like don't force yourself to have a conversation that's not helpful for you. But also know that, you know, if this conversation brings up fight, flight, or freeze response within your body, that's gonna feel like I'm unsafe and I need to run away. So recognizing that and being aware of that is important when we engage in these conversations.
Thank you. I'd like to, at this point, open it up to questions from the group. I know that some people will probably start to trickle out just because some people are here around the class time. But if you, so it's helpful for me. I know people in class and I could name names, but if you could introduce yourself too, if you feel comfortable. You don't have to.
Hello, I'm Nolan. I'm here with the Urban Politics class. And My question is sort of about, you got, a lot of the panel discussion was about making the conversations constructive and building a relationship with, or a rapport with a person, and attacking ideas and not people. So one time I was walking out of I was in the student center, and there were these two young women who were having a really heated discussion with another young woman, and it was something, I wasn't able to hear it, but it was something, they were confronting her about something they felt was racist that she had said or done. And I was wondering, at what point, like if you are encountering someone who is a stranger to you and people want to have some kind of conversation with them, is there a way to do that in a way that is constructive? Because it didn't sound constructive. You know, I don't feel like it accomplished anything. They were just yelling at each other. So I wonder.
Yeah, for me, I wouldn't have engaged in that conversation, right? Like, I obviously don't know any more of the context, but it wouldn't have been a conversation that, if I couldn't figure out within the first 2 or 3 minutes, that I would have wanted to engage longer in, just because I don't know their intention. Like there's so many other things, and maybe having more context, I could give you a better answer. But it doesn't sound like that was a conversation. It would have been productive, or that it would have been worth my time to stay there, because it just seems like folks are just angry and upset, and they're not hearing each other, right? Like they're just yelling and screaming.
So this situation was like two folks were confronting one person, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can't really say without having been there, but I imagine it would have gone a little bit differently if it was one-on-one. And, the concept of like calling folks out is, something we're discussing a lot these days. And I would say if you do need to call someone out, if you want them to hear you, you have to hear them first. So if you want someone to hear what you have to say, and if you're trying to share with someone like that their behavior was not helpful or that they should have done it in a different way, they're not going to hear you if you don't hear them. So there was a research project in the most recent election in California where folks went door to door to try and get folks to vote on a certain issue. And as a result of using reflective listening techniques, they were actually able to get their issue passed. And they did a whole research component on using actual reflective listening skills to get someone to change their mind. So I think it's possible, but the dynamics matter. If it's not a helpful conversation, you're not going to change hearts and minds. And changing hearts and minds is very, very difficult to do. And again, you're not going to do it unless you don't make that person feel heard. Go ahead.
My name is Alicia Berry, and I was wondering, what would be the best way to approach, like maybe if you are having a conversation with someone who is not relatively difficult, and in the beginning they're receptive, and then you can start to see that they're closing off. Like, what's the best way to end the conversation? Should you come out and ask them, like, hey, like, are you okay? Like, I talk about something, or you just say, okay, you should talk, or what's the best way to end the conversation?
So Brady mentioned noticing body language. I will say, like, something's changed. What's going on? I noticed something's coming up for you. Unless I am aware that I'm like traumatizing that person and poking further is not going to be helpful to them. Sometimes I'm like, yeah, let's talk. I'm that professor that's like, let's talk about this issue, day one, and folks are like, it's noticing, it's, and maybe sometimes it's acknowledging like, hey, maybe I said or did something that like brought something up for you. And also, sometimes this sounds so goofy, but ask yourself, like, what did I literally just do before they changed? So I remember a situation where I was teaching a class and I had a student who wasn't very engaged, and then one day there was a situation where they ended up getting really upset with me in the class, and I was like, student never talks, and now they're talking a lot, and then I was like, okay, what did I just do before that happened? And I had asked a really personal question that brought really strong feelings for that person. And so when I took a step back, I realized that it was an action that I had taken that caused them to kind of switch into a different part. And so noticing, asking if there's something we can do differently, or maybe we need to take a break, maybe we need to break bread and then come back to the table. I think there's a few different ways that we can engage on that. But, you know, being okay with that discomfort too. I think a lot of times as humans we're like, oh, don't be mad, don't be sad. And just, you know, meeting someone where they're at, that tends to make a huge difference.
So you guys talked about, I'm Theo Muller, but you guys talked a lot about like hard conversations, difficult dialogues, and I was thinking like, what is the goal? Like, what is your like cutoff for where the goal of your difficult discussion is? Because I'm like, so you brought up the example of the people in California, but with a single other person, like how important is it? Like, I would think that it would be better to avoid a difficult discussion about, I wrote down institutionalized racism. Like, the odds you're going to change someone's mind on institutionalized racism are pretty low. So, like, do you guys have a personal thing of, like, what are topics that you're willing to go into with a difficult discussion and what's not worth it? Or?
So, in the workshops that I do, I basically say, I'm not here to change your mind, I'm here to give you information, right? And so, I think that raising a level of consciousness helps, right? And so more than anything, if I can plant a seed to get you to think about it, right? To think about it differently. You know, I'm not trying to change your mind, but think about it in this way. I feel like the conversation for me would be a success. In terms of like the more personal dynamic, so I live, eat, and breathe this at work. When I'm at home, I'm not engaging in these conversations, and I'm not engaging with people that it's too exhausting. And self-care for me means that, you know, this is what I do at work, and when I'm at home, I'm not engaging in these conversations. And if I know that we're completely on the opposite spectrum, that's okay. We can agree to disagree, but I don't want to talk politics with you, or whatever it is, right? And I, for example, have a good friend, and her husband and I, like, he always wants to try to like poke the bear, right? Like, he always wants to, you know, try to have this. Like, dude, I'm not doing this with you, right? Like, you've known me long enough to know that I'm not gonna bite, right? But I think it's important to, again, recognize these spaces. But for me, I'm not trying to change your mind. I just want to share some information with you. I want to give you a different perspective.